Back in September 2019, 80/20 staff, among many others, were involved in the Youth Strike for Climate in Dublin city centre. We travelled with students from Bray and walked with them from the Customs House on the Quays up to Merrion Square to where a temporary stage was set up to address the crowd. Thousands of young climate strikers planned for their phone alarms to go off simultaneously at 11 minutes to 1 as a symbolic gesture. At that same moment, a clock was smashed on the stage to represent the 11 years remaining to avert a climate catastrophe. That sense of urgency has only intensified in the years that have gone by. However, it's becoming increasingly drowned out by everything else that is happening in the world right now. Ongoing wars, genocide, the rise of the far right and fascist movements that feed into climate change, cynicism and denial. One of the young strikers there that day was Beth Doherty, who joins me for this episode of Irish Global Solidarity in 100 Objects podcast. I have to say, speaking with Beth was a breath of fresh air and a powerful reminder that there's still so much we can do and must do on climate change. Despite ongoing cynicism around youth strikes and youth activism, Beth's story cuts through that noise. She has carved out her own path, initially becoming interested in the issues after reading the IPCC report when she heard about it on the news, to joining climate strikes, to representing Ireland as a youth delegate at COP, to becoming an Arctic angel advocating for what she refers to as Earth's air conditioning system. We also discuss her research in Ireland on human rights and the Convention of the Rights of the Child and how they are linked to climate change. Beth Doherty's dedication to climate justice is inspirational, to say the least. This episode is a strong reminder of why young people must be part of conversations about these issues shaping our world. It's not just their future at stake, but their present too. So, Beth Doherty, good morning and welcome to the Irish Global Solidarity in 100 Objects podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on.
So I suppose we'll jump right into it. I know that you've been involved in climate activism for, I'm going to say 5 years now, I think it is. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, coming up on 6 now in February, which is really hard to believe. Yeah,
6 years. Wow. So go back to the beginning. Tell me, how did you get involved? How did it all start? What was the kind of catalyst for you, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, so I got involved when I was 15, and I guess the catalyst for me personally was the IPCC report that came out. It was in the news. It was up until fairly recently the most recent one, but now we do have a new one, the 6th report from them. And it really highlighted how urgent the crisis was. And I think up until that point, I had, I guess, the privilege of growing up in Ireland, a global north country that is not really seeing the impacts of climate change right now. Whereas obviously there are young people growing up around the world who would have been much more familiar and have directly seen those impacts far before this kind of became such a concrete reality for me. And I think it really woke me up to the fact that, yes, I had learned about it in school in kind of, the reduce, reuse, recycle kind of terms. And I was aware that, of course, there was climate change happening, but I think it really brought it into quite a concrete reality for me in terms of how urgent it was, how soon it was going to impact us. And from there, a group of friends and I, we kind of started talking about the climate strikes, which had started, and we decided to try and organise one in March 2019. And that was actually my first ever protest. We organised the first ever climate strike in Dublin, which had about 10,000 people. And from there, then we kind of organised the climate strikes throughout that kind of period.
Wow. And you and your friends, you were in, where were you based?
Oh, I was based in Dublin, where I grew up.
Oh, okay. So it was just you and some friends in school then decided to start organising, I suppose, is the word for it really, isn't it? And getting people together.
Yeah, I think the really exciting thing was it was from a load of different schools. So we kind of met across the country. And so I think from the start, it was quite a good network of young people from a lot of different counties, a lot of different parts of the country, a lot of different schools. And then also something really exciting was that we worked so much with other organisations also in this space, whether it was, the trade unions, whether it was other groups that brought together schools, climate NGOs, organisations that had been in the space for a very long time. And so also brought a lot of knowledge and support to support it as well. But yeah.
Great, amazing. And you mentioned the IPCC report. Did you come across that yourself, or was it a teacher that kind of brought it to your attention, or how did it come into? How did you find it? How did you come across it?
I read about it in the news, and I saw the report, and I got quite Upset is probably too vague of a word to use it, but it did provoke quite a reaction in me, and I think was really that moment where I woke up to the reality of what was happening and how urgent it was.
Yeah, it's scary reading stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think up until that point, a lot of the language had been very, this is a problem in the future, this is going to happen in the future. For me, I was like, well, no, it's affecting people my age right now.
And like, especially to even just to go back to your point about reduce, reuse, recycle, you're kind of almost led to believe that that's sufficient and that will do. So then to be hit with something like the content of those reports, I'm sure is very shocking,
Absolutely, I think you're right. Like the reduce, reuse, recycle language, obviously it's fantastic, I think, to teach about these kinds of things. But I think the focus a lot of the time in the discourse I saw around climate change was very individualistic. It was very kind of, this is what you as an individual can do. But I think ultimately, this is such a structural crisis. We need collectivistic change. And I think that's what really appealed to me about kind of mass movement and protest, particularly with Fridays for Future, was that it was really people coming together as a collective and to demand change from the people in power and to demand change in the structures which are causing this crisis, and those structures in turn often leaving people with no choices other than potentially the unsustainable options,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And collective action is so important for so many reasons, for like exactly what you're saying, but also when you're kind of struggling and you're feeling like nothing is changing or nothing is happening. When you're in a group, you get that group support. So you're not, like you say, if you're on your own trying to do this stuff is one thing, but when you have people around you, if you're feeling despair or despondent with what's happening, you have that group around you to kind of keep the movement going and to keep you going within that movement as well, and to kind of pick you up if you falter too. Like collective action is so important, to have those communities around you. It's a really important thing. And I found it so I found it empowering and I found it encouraging and so hopeful, seeing so many young people being involved in coordinating this, never mind participating, but coordinating the actual actions themselves. It was so impressive, like without sounding patronising or condescending. It really was so impressive. And I suppose to bring it back to the exhibition, I know you were on the stage at one of the climate protests in Dublin when the clock was smashed, the clock that we have in the exhibition. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that clock and why it was there and the meaning, the symbolic gesture behind the smashing of the clock?
Yeah, so the clock was smashed on stage at 11 minutes to 1 and everyone's phone alarms went off as well at that point in time. And what that was to symbolise was, given that it was in 2019 and given that IPCC had found that we have until 2030 to avert the most significant impacts of climate change, it was really to signify, look, we've got 11 years left. What that brings up for me right now as I think about it is, we're 6 years on, we've got 5 years left. Are we looking like we're going to meet that deadline? But I think, in the moment that was really trying to draw attention to the urgency, the lack of time left. And I think it was also trying to use kind of creative approaches to give that very visual and kind of audio effect as well to kind of bring people together around that message.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know when we had people come and visit the exhibition itself, people did remember the clock from participating, and that was people who would have been from trade unions and people within our sector, not necessarily even young people who were participating in the protest themselves. I remember actually 80/20 staff went on a bus that day with students from Bray, I think they were coming from the Educate Together school, but there was a group of students anyway. We got a bus with them into Dublin, and just the energy on the bus that day and the enthusiasm of everyone. And there was teenagers, young adults who were on the bus being interviewed by the likes of Claire Byrne and Pat Kenny and stuff like that while we were going into the protest. And there was definitely, while they were applauding their enthusiasm, there was definitely a lot of cynicism towards them and a bit of dismissiveness from, I suppose, adults outside of that, perhaps the groups that were coordinating and getting together. How did you feel about that response that you got from people, the cynicism?
So in terms of the cynicism and I guess potentially dismissiveness, I think, particularly the group I was involved in, Fridays for Future, we were entirely youth-led. We didn't have any adults, I say, kind of supervising or coordinating. We had a lot of support and guidance from older groups. And I think we were very lucky to have that kind of intergenerational knowledge sharing. So I will say there was lots of older people, I say, than 15, 16, supporting us, giving us that knowledge. But in the same way, I mean, there's always going to be people who try and dismiss it. I think particularly as young people, there was kind of a skepticism about, did we know enough? Were we mature enough? We still get that. I mean, recently there was a video that I was talking in and someone was like, get this child off this video. And I was like, I'm 21, but I'm so grateful you think I'm that young. There's dismissiveness. I think that is amplified for young women, for young non-binary people, for anyone who kind of is a gender minority and young. There is often kind of, I guess, dismissiveness multiplied across several areas, right? And I think, but particularly for young people generally, there was a lot of rhetoric kind of dismissing the strikes in some ways. But I think there was also a lot of older people, and that was they were my favourite older people who kind of said, you know what, this is really important. It's actually really good to see young people taking that stand. Young people are often marginalised. They're often not listened to, particularly that's obviously amplified if you're a young person from another marginalised background, like being a person of colour. And I think it was the older people who said, no, do you know what? You know what you're talking about. For those of us in the group who maybe had seen the impacts of climate change, you know what you've seen, you know the impacts you've experienced. And you know what you want your future to look like, and also you know what you want your present to look like. Because, although the name was Fridays for Future, it was not just about what the future was going to look like, right? It was about young people as actors and as stakeholders in the present day. Although we did definitely face that cynicism from some people, I think in a way, at least for me, it was kind of one of those things that you just accepted was going to happen. You kind of just got on with it.
Yeah. And I think your story, just to use that word for a minute, your journey, I suppose, is a perfect example of, or it's an antidote to all of that cynicism, I think, as well, because so many people would have been saying, oh, you're only looking for a day off school and you're only there to get out of that. And I'm sure there were people who were there for that reason. However, your story, your journey is an antidote to all of that, because you're still active in this area and you have been for a number of years, and you continue to be. And are some of your friends who you would have started out with, are they still kind of active and involved?
There's so many people who I worked with on the strikes across the various different groups that were part of organising. We had Fridays for Future, we had the Schools Climate Action Network SCAN, and there was lots of different groups that were involved in organising these strikes. And a lot of the young people who were involved are still very heavily involved in climate advocacy and advocacy for other social justice issues, have really brought that into kind of whatever they're studying or wherever they're working. And I think there's this wonderful group of young people in Ireland, even those who weren't involved at the strike. There's so much creativity and energy and so many solutions as well, and powerful advocacy coming from young people in Ireland. I look up to so many of the people I worked with on the strikes, and they have now, gone on to do such incredible things with different organisations and in different spaces. And really, I think bringing together a movement and a community that is brave enough to reimagine how things work. And I think the strikes were definitely an example of that, where I learned so much from the other young people I was working with, as well as those coming from older NGOs and kind of sharing their knowledge with us as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely. Such an important community. When I was reading about you and what you've done, and I came across the phrase Arctic Angels, and I was like, what? And I went looking online to figure out what was going on. And I was like, no, do you know what? I'm just going to actually ask Beth directly herself. Tell me who and what are the Arctic Angels, and what do you do?
Yeah, so the Arctic Angels is a network I've been involved with now coming up on 5 years. So it's run by an organisation called Global Choices, who were founded with the aim of essentially protecting the Arctic, and particularly the Central Arctic Ocean, which is what's called a global commons. So basically parts of the Arctic are, I say, owned and kind of legally, I guess, between different states. So like Denmark, Canada, Norway, these kind of Arctic nations will own bits of that. But then there is kind of the North Pole and the surrounding ocean around that doesn't belong to any one state. And that's our global commons. And Global Choices is one of our global commons. Global Choices was founded to essentially try and protect that and really draw attention to how important the Arctic is, because I think sometimes we bring up the Arctic, and particularly, living in Ireland, it's like, well, that is miles away. Like, why would you be thinking about that? You're not in the Arctic, whatever.
It's over there, not over here.
It's over there, it's polar bears, it's not here. And I think really what Global Choices tries to draw attention to is that the Arctic is the air conditioning of the Earth. So the two poles, the Arctic and Antarctica, work together to cool our air. But because the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world, that ice is melting at an incredibly scary pace. And the thing with ice, right, the slogan of like Arctic Angels and Global Choices is that you can't plant it. You can't plant ice. Once it's gone, it is absolutely gone and you cannot get it back. And you lose that really crucial air conditioning effect. You also lose something called the albedo effect. And that's how the ice reflects the sun back out. So instead of the sun warming the ocean, causing it to rise, causing effects for sea life, which then have knock-on effects, obviously, for food supplies, you lose that. So essentially, we lose the ice. We are in a very dangerous situation globally in terms of combating climate change. So what Arctic Angels tries to do is it's a network of young women up until, I think, 35 from around the world. So we've got people from, I think, every continent except Antarctica. We might have someone in Antarctica at this stage, I actually don't know. But from across the world working to try and protect the Arctic. And so I've been working with them for the last 2 years now on something called a moratorium. So we're trying to propose a treaty that would stop industrial activity in the Central Arctic Ocean. So I've been working to the text for that, do legal research on that. We've been working with a team of Arctic Angels from around the world, and there's been some really great work trying to basically advocate for that, because as the ice is melting, my response is, oh my God, we should save it. The response of some others is we should drill for oil, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense. We're trying to say you shouldn't be able to drill for oil here. You should be trying to protect this ice while we still have it. And so we've been advocating for that COP28, COP29 this year. And at various different conferences as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. And such a great way to explain it too, the way you were saying about it being the air conditioning for the planet. That's fascinating. So you're saying you're working on a memorandum. Is that the kind of work that Arctic Angels do in general, is more kind of policy advocacy based stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, so we're working on the moratorium with...
Sorry, moratorium.
No, you're okay. No, you have to worry about it. So it's a moratorium. It's a 10-year pause on industrial activity in the Central Arctic Ocean. So that area beyond national jurisdiction that no country, quote unquote, owns. And I guess that's the main focus of Global Choices policy advocacy. Arctic Angels, they do all sorts of things. All of them are in different roles. Some of them are researchers. Some of them are kind of NGO workers. Some of them are campaigners. Some of them run their own organizations. We all come from very different backgrounds. But I think what's really wonderful about the network is that there's so much knowledge sharing, and everyone tries to bring the Arctic into their own work. So I've worked directly on the moratorium with Global Choices through my role as an Arctic Angel, but other Arctic Angels will, be working in policy in some way, and will try and bring in Arctic protection into that as well.
Wow, how interesting is that? That's fascinating. Really good. And it's all women. See, I'm telling you, put the women in charge. Things will get done so much quicker. Just put the women in charge. Somebody. It's really interesting though, yeah. And you're continuing to do that now, like you'll be there for as long as they need you, basically.
Yeah, I mean, we age out at 35, so I have years left in me as an Arctic Angel. So.
Now's the time. Another thing that I read about you as well is that you were appointed Ireland's Climate Youth Delegate. You're a busy woman. There's a lot going on. What kind of responsibilities are involved in that?
Yeah, so I came into the role as Climate Youth Delegate last April, so it's in its third year now. So there's been two before me, Ilon and Jenny, who were both absolutely fantastic. And essentially the role is being the youth kind of person within the Ireland's delegation to COP22 COP. So COP is the annual climate change conference. It stands for Conference of the Parties. People may have seen COP29 in the news recently. That's the 29th Conference of the Parties. We're actually in the 30th year, but because of COVID, we skipped one. And so every year, all the countries in the world get together and they essentially try and negotiate a way out of the climate crisis to varying degrees of success. And Ireland goes every year. And my role is to be the young person within that delegation. So over the summer last year, I did a series of consultations with my predecessor, Jenny. And we basically met with over 25 youth organisations around the country. We had a survey, we did a call for written submissions, all that kind of stuff. And
bringing the youth voice to COP, essentially.
I guess, yeah, trying to do that. And then also on the ground at COP, there's a cohort of Irish young people who attend from various organisations and really trying to support their participation, be there to answer questions on the negotiations and try and create spaces as well for them to meet directly with different decision makers, the minister who attends, stuff like this. We are lucky that in Ireland we have quite a strong presence at COP. We have quite a strong presence from the minister every year. Mm-hmm. And I guess trying to facilitate then those conversations, because each of those young people will be working on different incredibly important policy areas and trying to make sure they have spaces to discuss that with the decision makers, I guess.
And what was it like being at COP?
Yeah, I mean,
word frustrating comes to mind for me. No, I'm just curious as to what your opinion is.
Yeah, so this was my third year at COP. So the first 2 years I was in Glasgow and then I was in Dubai and I was there with NGOs. And then this year I was with the national delegation, my current role, which I just described. In terms of COP itself this year, I mean, the decision itself was very disappointing. The youth priorities we had done in the run-up to COP had been very clear on emphasising that the money needs to meet what's called the global climate finance need. The global climate finance need is pretty self-explanatory. It's how much money countries need to prevent climate change and to protect people from the effects of it. And also to compensate for, there are some things which we cannot even prevent the loss of. That's called loss and damage. That's the things that we have lost, whether that's people's lives, livelihoods, cultural monuments, things that are destroyed by climate disasters.
Okay.
And so all of that global climate finance need came to, I think, one estimate was $1 trillion a year, going up to maybe $5 trillion a year. So we're talking big, big numbers of money, right?
Yeah.
And the previous amount, there had been a goal created in the early 2010s in Copenhagen, maybe 2009, sorry. And that had been for 100 billion a year. That was met 2 years late in 2022. And this year now, the big focus was, right, well, what's our next goal going to be in terms of how much money we provide for this global provision of funding to stop the climate crisis and protect people from its effects. And again, like I said, the estimate was in the trillions. The amount that was agreed was 300 billion a year.
Wow.
Which, I'm no mathematician, but is very far below 1.3 trillion.
I was about to say, I'm terrible at maths and even I know that is not sufficient.
There was a very vague aspiration towards, maybe achieving 1.3 trillion at some point, but the actual, agreed goal that parties have committed themselves to is 300 billion a year. By the time the deadline for that is reached, inflation will mean that actually it's not even that much greater than the original 100 billion goal over a decade ago. And so the decision at COP was quite disappointing. I think the experience at COP is always very varied. You have the negotiation rooms which you might attend, and that might be, very engaging to see how these decisions are made, but I think potentially frustrating as well to see how much those kind of youth priorities are not lining up with what is actually being discussed and decided in these rooms. But I think there's also very empowering aspects of COP, which is kind of working with the other young people who are on the ground and kind of seeing them meet with decision makers and seeing them advocate for these things and being a very strong and powerful presence of civil society.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely a mixed kind of experience, but I was very grateful to be there and very grateful that I think Ireland supports youth participation through my role, through meeting with young people. Obviously there is always scope to extend youth engagement, youth participation, but I think it is very positive to see that.
I'd say it's a great opportunity for knowledge sharing as well, getting to meet people, especially from such different backgrounds, because sometimes we can be just in our own little bubble talking to each other, but then when you get to speak to people who are perhaps more affected by climate change directly, it brings a whole different perspective on how you might be advocating from then on, I know that you worked on a thematic report that was linked between children's rights and the climate crisis. And it's one thing that you don't actually see very often is linking the youth climate movement to, I suppose, young people asserting their rights and why that's important. And I just thought that maybe I might like to talk a little bit about that, the link between young people's rights, children's rights, human rights as well, and the climate crisis, because it's not a conversation you see very often.
Yeah, so that specific report we did with UNICEF Ireland. So it was over a period of 2 years, beginning when I was in my 6th year of school and finishing when I was in my 2nd year of uni. So we did a research process throughout the country. We engaged with different focus group surveys and that kind of thing. And we basically wanted to look at, there's the UN Convention on Children's Rights, which sets out a number of rights that children are guaranteed. And then obviously there's the climate crisis. And the reason we did this was every 5 years or so, there's something called a Universal Periodic Review. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child, who are like the overseeing body for this convention, meet in Geneva. They hear from the government, they hear from civil society, and they basically assess how well is Ireland doing on meeting its obligations towards children's rights. And so UNICEF Ireland approached us and we put together this report basically examining, right, what's the link between the climate crisis and children's rights in Ireland? And we found, for instance, that people in rural areas have much lower access to and much lower provision from the government of kind of adaptation measures, of, supports for climate change effects, even though rural and coastal areas are definitely going to be seeing those impacts. A lot of young people had already experienced the impacts of, say, flooding or storms that have been exacerbated by the climate crisis, but haven't received maybe the necessary support from the government. We found again there was a huge disparity between urban, particularly Dublin, areas and rural areas in terms of access to these kinds of provisions.
I think there's such a reluctance to even associate things like flooding with the idea of climate change. It's just like, oh no, this is just something that happens. It's not to do with climate change. Just that reluctance is incredible, I think.
Absolutely. And it's so important, I think, for us to draw those connections quite explicitly, because that's what allows people to understand, the political choice that is being made to continue the climate crisis, to continue being reliant on fossil fuels. And that is a political choice that is causing these harms to your community. I think people deserve to know the impacts of the political decisions being made by governments across the world and how that is directly causing flooding or storms that are damaging their homes, even though they are not the chief contributors to the climate crisis. And so that was definitely something we found, huge impacts on children's well-being, also on their right to be heard, particularly, Ireland does have a very strong civil society sector. And we are very fortunate in that our government does engage with civil society and that we are able to, I guess, campaign for climate change without being afraid of maybe the pushback or kind of dangerous effects from the government. We are very privileged in that way, but I think there is definitely still, room for improvement. That was something we saw from young people, calling for meaningful engagement, calling for kind of youth-led and youth-designed engagement as well, and engagement that's transparent about how what's said translates into change. And also, the report covered as well the reality of children in direct provision, especially as more and more people are going to be forced to move as a result of the climate crisis. We still don't have recognition for climate refugees in law, but it is the reality that climate change and all of its impacts will cause more people to move, and the experiences children are having in direct provision is just unacceptable. So that was something we tried to draw attention to in the report as well. And so I guess we went to the committee in Geneva, we presented it, and this was not because of our report in any way, shape or form. This has been a very long process prior to the report, but a few months later there was General Comment number 26, where the UN committee actually recognised a direct link between children's rights and the climate crisis, and that there is an obligation on states to tackle the climate crisis in order to protect children's rights.
Fantastic.
So I guess it was really trying to draw attention to, and I guess broader human rights as well. There is such a clear link with the climate crisis, and I think that is increasingly people trying to draw attention to that. We're seeing a lot of litigation. We saw the climate grannies case recently in the European Court.
Yeah.
So I think there is this increasing awareness that human rights are definitely are being threatened by the climate crisis, and that will continue to grow as that kind of continues, particularly for those who are most vulnerable, whether that's people in the global south seeing the impacts right now, refugees being mistreated in systems like direct provision, and just other people who are marginalised on various different bases across society as well.
I'm curious as you're talking, you mentioned it a couple of times about how Ireland is great for engaging with young people and listening to young people's voices and engaging them in certain processes like COP. And I'm aware that you're currently living in the UK. Do you see the same stuff happening in the UK with listening to young people's voices and them being invited into these spaces? And I mean, to go back to human rights again, definitely there seems to be some rights being eroded in the UK in relation to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, things like that. How different do you see Ireland and the UK being in those contexts?
I mean, I think it's tricky because a lot of my involvement has been quite Ireland-centric, but I think the primary thing that comes up for me in this kind of area is the shift towards protest and the law in the UK, and particularly the last Conservative government. But I mean, the legislation's still in place, even though we have a new government in the UK. And I'm not sure whether it will be repealed, but, the specific legislation being the Public Order Act, the Police the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, both of which introduced very severe powers for the police, both of which gave the police a lot of power to prevent protests, for instance, for being too noisy. If you're carrying a bicycle lock, for instance, that's the famous example, you could be preparing to do a lock on, so lock yourself onto something so the police can get involved there. Essentially, it's been widely criticised by various different organisations in the civil liberties space for introducing very, very strict restrictions on protests. And I think it's part of the broader, very worrying trend across Europe and the rest of the world as well, towards criminalising protests, towards reacting very disproportionately. I mean, there was 5 people given 21 years in prison between all 5 of them for planning a protest on a Zoom call. So not even following through with the protest, but just planning it on a Zoom call.
It just blows my mind. It's incredible.
And, for countries in the global north who put themselves out as, very committed to free speech and committed to freedom of human rights, it's complete hypocrisy to then crack down on protest in this way. And as a trend we're seeing not just in Europe, but across the world, we're seeing very violent crackdown on pro-Palestine protesters around the world. And in various different regions, we are definitely seeing this. And I think, there is that there is still huge discrepancies in terms of how safe it is to protest, how safe it is to criticise your government across the world. But I think we're seeing very worrying trends towards greater policing of protest and crackdowns in the UK and in the wider world, I guess, as well. I mean, it's across Europe as well, like this shift. And I think it becoming more politically acceptable to condemn environmental protesters or to crack down on pro-Palestine protesters or to use state violence and police violence against people, exercising, their right to protest and the right to criticise the government for supporting for, I guess not tackling the climate crisis, for supporting the fossil fuel industry and for different things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know myself from being at some of the pro-Palestine marches in Dublin more recently, I definitely noticed much more of a police presence. Now, whether they actually did anything or not, I don't know. I didn't see or hear any reports, but I thought that was kind of interesting, even just visually, to be able to see them being there more so. Now, normally they're there obviously to kind of just marshal or whatever, but there was definitely visibly more of a presence the last couple of times I've been at the pro-Palestine marches in Dublin, and I actually found it quite shocking, and it feels like it is a knock-on effect of what's happening in the UK. Like, it's only a matter of time really before that transfers over here,
Yeah, I think it's also, these kind of laws are very concerning to me because of the way they distract from the actual problem. If everyone is so worried about, blaming Just Stop Oil for, protesters, or being angry at farmers or different communities, everyone's kind of blaming each other. We lose focus on the fact that this is being caused by a political choice to continue making more money for fossil fuels for as long as possible. And you definitely see that reality on the ground at COP. Fossil fuel companies at every level of COP. There was 2,500 of them last year at COP28. There was over 1,700 of them this year, COP29. It was a smaller COP as well, so proportionately it was similar. And I think, if people are blaming environmental protesters, and if various different groups in society are turning the blame on each other, and I think we're right to criticise the differences I think we should definitely draw attention as well to the differences in how various different laws are applied and things like this. But I think it's also about, when is it time that we kind of recognise that actually I think oftentimes, particularly I've seen this in the UK in the last government, was kind of like blame environmental protests for your problems, and not the fact that the government has, slashed public services, has slashed provision of, say, the NHS is a great example in the UK, and the fact that, we're continuing to allow fossil fuel companies to make incredible profits in a year when people were choosing between heating and eating in the UK. And I think it's just about kind of realising that we're all in this together, and actually we need all of society to come together and protest together and stand up to this kind of thing and say, like you said, this is where all of us live, no matter who you are in society, no matter kind of what community you're coming from. We all need the governments to stop prioritising the profits of fossil fuels over our survival as a species. So yeah, I definitely agree with you there.
Yeah, I find people's attitude towards particularly the Just Stop Oil protesters, they're just... It's so shocking how negative people's comments are towards them. Like when you see a video on social media or whatever of somebody throwing somebody throwing soup at a painting, or there was the person who climbed up on the snooker table is it the Crucible? Is that where the snooker stuff happens? And putting orange powder, and people just lose their minds about the acts that people are carrying out, and saying that they're not doing anything for their cause by doing these things. And yet criticism, it's like what we were talking about yesterday, criticism about the farmers who are protesting in London, blocking all the streets and blocking everyone with their tractors. They're not, the same criticism isn't levelled at them either at all. And there's just such a hypocrisy there, I suppose. Who are we protecting? Are we protecting the money in people's pockets, or are we protecting the planet that we all live on? I remember seeing a tweet from somebody that was like, a person asked me, why do I care so much about the environment? And the response was, it's where I live. It's where we all live. And the person was just like, it was like that idea had never even occurred to them, that this is our planet. We all live here. It's for like the greater good, really, I suppose, to bring the story back to you personally, you're doing your master's now at the minute in LSE, isn't it? Remind me again. I know law is involved, but remind me again exactly.
Yeah, it's master's in law, but I'm focusing predominantly on climate change and international law, kind of human rights and civil liberties, and also a little bit of international criminal law. So it's kind of a mix of things.
And what next after this then?
Not entirely sure yet. I definitely want to go into, I think, advocacy on the climate crisis, obviously. But beyond that, still, I think just definitely going to take some time and try a few different things and see what works. Because
sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, uni has been a bit of a whirlwind. So we're trying to figure things out afterwards.
Well, it sounds like the last 5 years for you has been a bit of a whirlwind. Just like even thinking back on all the things that we've talked about, like you've been, as I said, you're a very busy woman. One of the things that we like to ask the guests on the podcast is about advice you might have for young people who are looking to get involved, whether it is in the climate movement, whether it's in some other global justice issues. What advice would you have for whether it's people who were your age when you began or your age now, young people for getting involved? What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think it's always that thing of it feels so incredibly overwhelming, right? And you look at the scale of the climate crisis, you look at the issues we've spoken about today, and it's not just the climate crisis, right? It's other social justice issues. Mm-hmm. It's a crackdown on protest. It's crackdown on civil liberties globally. That is really overwhelming. It's structural. It's systemic. It can be hard for us to envision the scale of the crisis as well. Mm-hmm. But I think it is so important that we do get involved, that we do organise. And organising in community, I think, is the really important thing, because that's also what draws those connections between people, draws a connection between different issues that different people are facing, and I think allows us to build a really strong coalition across society. And I think recognising the climate change impacts in your community, that will differ from community to community. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm living in Dublin, that's going to be different impacts and different realities than someone living in a more rural community, for instance. And I think people in their own communities understand best the issues their communities are facing and what needs to be done. And I think getting involved in your community, seeing what can be changed, seeing what your community needs, organising to advocate for that, to build, because I think we have so much power when we come together. You know, that's such a cliche to say, but it is that collective power when people organise together. It can be so much stronger than one person. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So talking to your friends, talking to your family members, talking about, you know, the issues you're seeing in your community and taking that to a local or a national or even an international level, but really trying to organise for change in that way. And I think remembering that is historically, you know, we have seen change come from people coming together collectively and standing up against these kinds of political choices that are being made. So yeah, I guess that really boils down to getting involved, finding your community, organising in your community, and I guess trying to keep that momentum and that pressure going.
Thanks, Beth. That's a really important message, and we appreciate it a lot. Thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
This podcast is brought to you by developmenteducation.ie, run by AidLink, Concern Worldwide, the Irish Development Education Association, the National Youth Council of Ireland, Self-Help Africa, Trócaire, and 80/20 Educating and Acting for a Better World, with support from Irish Aid. This podcast is hosted by me, Ciara Regan, produced by Tony Daly and Catherine Howley. Our theme music is by Jump Lead. We'll see you the next episode.